Good morning, ACS, and welcome to Day 2 of the 2014 convention. My name is Julie Fernandez, and I'm happy to be attending this convention this year as a first-time member of the ACS Board of Directors. At ACS, as you all know, we're about protecting the right to vote, safeguarding the rights of the accused, securing equal opportunity, and promoting a progressive vision of law and policy that is true to our Constitution's core values. One lesson I've learned over the many years that I've worked in Washington, D.C. as a civil rights advocate and lobbyist is that if I'm ever feeling cynical about Congress, thinking that members aren't that substantive, that they only care about raising money or raising their own profiles, the best antidote I know is to pay a visit to our next speaker, Congressman Bobby Scott. Bobby Scott is a legislator. He probes issues, grapples with tough ones, works for bipartisan compromise, and above all, is in this to get things done. Important things. Things that make a difference in our communities, to our families, and to the country. Bobby Scott sees the problems that matter most and is determined to get up every day and find solutions. Mr. Scott has represented Virginia's 3rd District since 1993 and served in the Virginia General Assembly for 15 years prior to that. Over this distinguished career, Congressman Scott has been a leader in efforts to reform our criminal justice system to make it more humane and effective, break the school-to-prison pipeline, and improve access to high-quality education for all children, regardless of their zip code, race, income, or disability. Bobby Scott's leadership has been particularly critical in recent years as relentless attacks on our right to vote have escalated. He's a vocal opponent of the voter suppression laws that have been sweeping our country. And when the court eviscerated the Voting Rights Act last year, almost a year ago today, Congressman Scott worked with a bipartisan group of legislators to craft a bill that would restore its protections. We're grateful that Representative Scott is once again serving on the honorary host committee for this convention. He's a great friend of ACS, and I am proud to say a friend of mine. We're all lucky to have him on our side. Please join me in welcoming Representative Bobby Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for your very kind introduction and all of the work that you have done. All those meetings I've been in on voting rights and everything else, you've been right there. So thank you for your good work. Apparently, I didn't get the memo on how congressmen are supposed to act. I didn't know we're supposed to be self-serving, spend all our time in fundraising. Good morning. You know, what the American Constitutional Society does is extremely important. You ensure that our law is a force to improve the lives of people. You help shape the debate on important legal issues to aid those of us in Congress. You build and support networks of academics, practitioners, and policymakers dedicated to our core constitutional values of equity, liberty, and justice for all. Since your founding in 2001, the ACS has been making a difference. The strength of your ideas and the scope of your national network have enabled you to make a difference in legal and public policy debates and ensure that the law is a force to improve the lives of all people. You are the embodiment of the principle that law should be a force of positive change by shaping the debate on crucial legal and constitutional issues through the development and promotion of high-impact ideas on opinion leaders, policymakers, legislators, and the media. In your relatively short history, you have been a consistent voice promoting the U.S. constitutional values of individual rights and liberties, genuine equality, access to justice, democracy, and the rule of law. And in so doing, you have provided the much-needed counter to what has been a growing and activist conservative legal movement that is seeking to erode our enduring constitutional values and reshape the American legal landscape on issues that reach from federal regulation to separation of church and state and many others. And you certainly made a difference last night when 300 members of the House voted to try to conform our government's mass data collection to some constitutional principles. Over 300 members of the House voted for that amendment to the defense bill. So I assure you that I speak for many when I say thank you for your service. And I was asked to say a few words about the criminal justice system. For far too long, our criminal justice system and policies have tipped the scales in favor of slogans and sound bites over common sense. The approach has locked away our youth, torn away families. A disproportionate number of them are minorities. As an intelligent, your intelligent constitutional approach works in crime policy. But unfortunately, during my more than 30 years of public service, I've learned that when it comes to crime policy, we have a choice. We can reduce crime, or we can play politics. And unfortunately, playing politics has ruled the day. The so-called tough on crime slogans, 3 strikes and you're out, you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. As appealing as some of these slogans may be, their impacts range from negligible to actually increasing the crime rate. As a result, the United States now locks up a higher portion of its population than any country on earth by far. There are 2.3 million people behind bars today, triple what was there in 1987. Over 700 persons incarcerated for every 100,000 in population. The United States is number 1 in the world. The average rate around the world is about 2 or 300, 1, 2, 300 per 100,000. We're at 700 per 100,000. The Pew Center on States suggests that anything over 350 per 100,000, you're actually diminishing returns on your investment. Anything over 500 is actually counterproductive, and here we are at 700 per 100,000. It's counterproductive because you got so many people in prison, you're wasting so much money, you're messing up so many families that you're actually adding to crime when you exceed 500 per 100,000. Now, crime policy has also been a challenge to constitutional principles because the tough on crime approach falls hardest on minorities. While the incarceration rate on average for the United States is about 700 per 100,000 blacks, the average is 22 per 100,000. About 10 states lock up African Americans at the rate of almost 4,000 per 100,000, a rate 20 or 40 times the international average, creating what the Children's Defense Fund calls the cradle-to-prison pipeline. Over 2,000 federal prisoners are serving constitutionally suspect sentences of life without parole for nonviolent drug offenses, and many more serving unduly harsh sentences for other nonviolent offenses. The war on drugs has been a war on communities of color. Racial disparities are staggering, despite the fact that whites engage in drug offenses at a higher rate than African Americans, according to some studies. African Americans are incarcerated for drug charges at a rate 10 times that of whites. And so when we incarcerate drug offenders, they stay locked up for lengthy periods of time, often forever. We increasingly sentence them to life in prison under so-called 3 strikes laws for petty drug offenses. And disappointingly, the Supreme Court has upheld the constitutionality of laws imposing disproportionate mandatory sentences of life without parole for simple possession of drugs. And so we're relegated to a legislative response, which is a lot more difficult than the constitutional approach when you get some of these issues, and that's why I, along with Tom Massey from Kentucky, introduced the Justice Safety Act valve of 2013, which would authorize sentencing courts to, in some circumstances, to sentence persons below a mandatory minimum if the sentence is obviously too lengthy, unjust, unreasonable, or violates common sense. The other bill, the Smarter Sentencing Act, wouldn't eliminate mandatory minimums, so it would significantly reduce them, so you could have a little common sense in sentencing. Bills have been introduced in both the House and the Senate. The Senate committee marked up the Smarter Sentencing Act. We have been trying to show people that mandatory minimums are inherently reprehensible because they will always, at some point or another, require judges to impose sentences that violate common sense. The bill was reported out of committee. That's the good news. The bad news is, when you looked up, they added mandatory minimums to the code in that bill. Now, you can't make this stuff up. There are obviously a lot more people helped in the legislation than hurt, but how you can end up with a bill finally dealing with mandatory minimums that creates new mandatory minimums certainly boggles the mind. We have had an over-reliance to incarceration for many years, and that over-reliance does not come for free. Since 1980, the cost of incarceration for the country has risen from about $17 billion to over $68 billion, adjusted for inflation. And by now, we've learned that we cannot incarcerate our way out of this problem. Prevention is a more logical and intelligent response. There is now overwhelming evidence to show that it is entirely feasible to rely less on incarceration and move people away from the cradle-to-prison pipeline into a cradle-to-college and career pipeline. All credible evidence shows that if you want to reduce violent crime, particularly among juveniles, a continuum of locally tailored, comprehensive, evidence-based prevention and intervention programs for youth identified as being at risk of involvement of delinquent behavior, or for those already involved, will greatly reduce crime and save much more money than they cost compared to the avoided law enforcement and social welfare expenditures. A continuum of services would have to start real early, and I mean real early, with teen pregnancy prevention, so fewer babies are born into dysfunctional families. Prenatal care can reduce mental retardation and learning disabilities. Nurse visits have been shown to significantly reduce child abuse, which is highly correlated with future crime. Early childhood education, after-school programs, getting young people into that college, into the cradle to college and career pipeline has been shown effective, very effective. We also know that education is a significant part of that strategy. And there are many areas in the Constitution that this organization deals with education that are constitutional issues, like the achievement gap, where you acknowledge that you're educating black children to the 10th grade, white children to the 12th grade, an achievement gap. My recollection of the Brown case said that you cannot deny children of the minority group of an equal educational opportunity, and how you can acknowledge that blacks are getting an education to the 10th and everybody else is getting an education to the 12th, how that doesn't deny the children of the minority race of an equal educational opportunity. It obviously does. And when they say it costs too much, there's a line of cases in special ed. It said that children are entitled to a free and appropriate education. Didn't ask you what it cost. You have an obligation to educate people. And so if you have an achievement gap, you've obviously violated the Constitution, and saying that it costs too much or it's inconvenient is no excuse. And this organization is working hard to make sure that we eliminate the achievement gap based on constitutional principles. And also the funding equity, where the children that need the most actually get the less because they're in zip codes with low property values, violating the equal protection where they actually need more. We need funding equity. Those constitutional principles are hurting our effort to use education to get young people on the right track and keep them on the right track. I've introduced legislation called the Youth Promise Act, which will take into consideration the fact that getting young people on the right track and keeping them on the right track is a much better strategy. It's more of a process, really, than a program, because what it does is it requires you to get the community together, figure out what you're spending on incarceration and other social pathology that you know you can reduce with good strategies, come up with an evidence-based plan to do something about it. Now, the Youth Promise Act will pay for the planning. A lot of these numbers nobody knows. If you ask people how much in the school zone you're spending on incarceration and teen pregnancy, no one will know. So figure out those numbers and put them on the table. People will be shocked, because in some communities that number is going to rival the school board budget. same order of magnitude, that they're wasting and counterproductive incarceration and teen pregnancy that can be reduced. Run the programs, study them as you go, and as you go, find out who's saving money and get them to kick back some of the money to keep the programs going. Now, we know this strategy works. In Pennsylvania, they funded about 100 programs, spent $60 million, and they went back a couple of years and found that they'd saved over $300 million in reducing incarceration, teen pregnancy expenses, Medicaid and social services, and other problems that they reduced. They saved $300 million. In Richmond, Virginia, they had a program where we had in a neighborhood 19 murders one year. A couple of years later, it was down to 2. It works, and it saves money. If you go from 19 murders to 2, the Medical College of Virginia will save the program cost of $2.5 million just in uncompensated medical care for all the gunshot wounds that they didn't have to treat. And so we know that the programs work. We know they save more money than they cost. And so this is a strategy that works. And when you have a constitutional analysis, we know that these programs can be enacted. One of the things that happens, and I talked to Cynthia Robbins, who had a law review article that pointed out that if you have a discriminatory policy, that's not enough just to prove the discrimination. You have a policy that is more expensive, that hurts minorities, you get them in the cradle-to-prison pipeline. When you had alternatives, just proving the discrimination isn't enough. What she has suggested is you have what are called notice hearings, where you go to the school board or you go to the legislature and point out that you have other alternatives rather than the discriminatory, money-wasting strategies. You have more cost-effective, less discriminatory strategies that actually work. And if you choose the discriminatory strategy, you can get past the hurdle of proving intent. Now, we need to focus on these because all through the criminal justice system, you have discriminatory impact. Now we have to show discriminatory intent, and these kinds of hearings can certainly make a difference. We know there are other issues involved in the criminal justice system. The death penalty is obviously one of them. Death penalty has been shown to waste money, discriminate against minorities, be applied by mistake, be totally arbitrary in its application. The lawyer you have is more of a factor in the death penalty than the crime itself. But unfortunately, we had passed what is called the Effective Death Penalty Act, where if all you have is evidence that you're probably innocent, that's not even enough for a hearing. You have to have clear and convincing evidence, more than just probable. I guess the idea that we didn't want to clog up the courts with people that were probably innocent, because that would be inconsistent with an effective death penalty. Our criminal justice system is premised on the assumption of innocence, the golden thread of common law dating back to the Romans. 1895, the Supreme Court quoted a Roman official who wrote, "It is better to let the crime of a guilty person go unpunished than to condemn the innocent." In recent years, developments of DNA evidence analysis shows us unequivocally that we have been violating this principle with astounding frequency. Since the death penalty was reinstated in 1977, over 100 people on death row have been exonerated. While the DNA evidence has provided uncontrovertible proof that innocent people are sentenced to death in our country, despite the reverence for the presumption of innocence, DNA evidence is simply a way to evaluate flaws in the system. It's not really part of the system. It's like an umpire standing aside, seeing if we got it right. And so you got questions like, what is wrong with a system where, but for DNA evidence, innocent people are going to be put to death? And what happens to people who go through the same system with no DNA evidence? What is there to correct those mistakes? So what we already know is that many people are erroneously convicted, sentenced, including being sentenced to death because of our willingness to tolerate significant defects in our criminal justice system. These defects fall into several broad categories. Governmental misconduct is one. Add that to inaccurate witness identifications, jailhouse snitches, confused confessions by mentally retarded or distressed defendants. News Today had the New York Central Park rapists settling their case for $40 million because they had been coerced in confessing. Subsequently, the real culprit confessed, and they had served time in jail and prison and all of that spectacle because they were coerced into confession. We can understand why we have an epidemic. Racial minorities have been prosecuted under the federal death penalty far beyond their proportion in the general population. Analysis of prosecutions under the death penalty provisions of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act show that almost 90% of the defendants selected for capital punishment have either been African American or Hispanic. Subsequent studies have shown similar results. We need to get back to where the Supreme Court declared, where Harry Blackmun, unfortunately, in a dissent, said that 20 years have passed since this court declared that the death penalty must be imposed fairly and with reasonable consistency or not at all, and despite the efforts of the states and courts to devise legal formulas and procedural rules to meet this daunting challenge, the death penalty remains fraught with arbitrariness, discrimination, caprice, and mistake. From this day forward, I will no longer tinker with the machinery of death. We have other Supreme Court cases similarly, but we haven't been able to get a majority. When you add to that the recent spectacle of Oklahoma's bundle execution, we have to start asking people the question whether or not the death penalty is popular. The question, according to polls, is to ask, in general, do you support the death penalty? Unfortunately, we need to ask whether you support the death penalty as it is, with all the arbitrariness, mistake, caprice, discrimination, and spectacle. Do you support that death penalty? Well, those are the kinds of questions that we're dealing with. Those are the kinds of questions that we need to be addressing. And your work as it is helping Congress do its job. We couldn't do it without groups like the American Constitution Society. I encourage you all to keep up the good work and make sure members of Congress and the public are informed on important work that needs to be done in our nation. If we are to have a fair and cost-effective criminal justice system, we need people like you to evaluate our policies on a constitutional, evidence-based, research manner. You're doing outstanding, much-needed work, and without you, the world would be much more of a mess. So keep up the good work. Thank you very much.